Well, all right, guys, here we are again with our Daniel study. And today we're just going to go through one verse, but I want to get it in context. And so let's read Daniel 1, 1 through 10. It says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, "I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So that would endanger my head with the king." All right, well, last week we saw the defeat of Jerusalem and the exile of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to Babylon, where they were placed into an intense education that lasted for 3 years. Now, this was all part of the Babylonian brainwashing. They isolated these young men from everything that they knew, from their home, their family, and friends, which made them extremely vulnerable to the new mindset of Babylon, which was contained in the ideas they would be studying for the initial 3 years they were there. They would be learning the Babylonian wisdom, culture, and language. Also during this time, they would be enjoying the best Babylon had to offer. They'd be eating the same food and drinking the same wine the king partook of. This was all designed to turn these Hebrews into Babylonians, to steal their loyalty to their God and replace it with an allegiance to King Nebuchadnezzar, the one who was sweeping them off their feet with the luxuries of Babylon. Now, in this study, we're going to see a choice Daniel makes that guards his heart from compromise and keeps his God as the focus of his life and the treasure of his heart. And we're only going to be looking at one verse today because of its importance. And so we're going to look at the choice that sets the tone of the whole book, Daniel 1:8. "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." Now, why did Daniel consider partaking of this food and drink a defiling of himself spiritually? Food and wine are neutral, right? Jesus declared all foods clean in Mark 7, and he drank wine, so this wasn't sinful in and of itself. But for the Jew living under the Mosaic law, it was different for a number of reasons. Heathen nations ate animals that were considered unclean and therefore forbidden by Jewish law. But even if the animals were clean and permitted in their law, the way they'd be prepared would be forbidden. The food wasn't kosher. It wasn't prepared in accordance with their Jewish law. Plus, the meat and wine were dedicated to idols by a religious rite. So this meant to participate in these feasts offered to these young men would be to participate in the worship of idols. So Daniel understood to partake in this food as a Jew would be to defile himself before God. So he resolved to refrain from the food and wine the others would be eating and drinking. But this couldn't have been an easy decision, right? So let's look at that, the difficulty of this decision. Now, the first reason it would be difficult was because King Nebuchadnezzar was not a man to be trifled with. He expected full compliance and was well known for his brutality when he was disappointed. One of his favorite reactions was throwing people into the fiery furnace. So Daniel understands going against the king's wishes here was risking his life. But, and this is very important, the cost of obedience isn't the issue. It can't be. Not if Jesus is Lord. Now, I think of a story in The Insanity of God by Nick Rifkin. I mean, it's an excellent book. And he tells of a Russian pastor who was arrested and put in prison for his faith, which left his wife and family destitute. And one night, as they were eating their last crust of bread, they cried out to God for help. And at that very same moment, God was answering that prayer by speaking to a deacon of a church some 20 miles away that had food. Now, the problem was the cost. This was in the days of horse and buggy, and it was the middle of winter in Siberia. So God tells this deacon to get up, get his horse, hitch it to the sleigh, and take this desperate family some food. Now, I'll pick up the story there. The deacon said, "But Lord, I can't do that. It's below zero outside. My horse might freeze, and I might freeze." Now, he was basing his choice to obey on the cost of obedience. And so, no thank you. And the Holy Spirit told him, "You must go. The pastor's family is in trouble." And the man continued to argue, "Lord, you've got to know that there are wolves everywhere. They could eat my horse, and if they do that, they'll eat me too. I'll never make it back." Now listen to what God told him. He said, "You don't have to come back. You just have to go." In other words, who said anything about coming back? That's not the issue. I just told you to go, so go. And as the story continues, he did go, and he did get home again, and that church continued to provide for that family until the pastor was released from prison. But I think that's a great example of what Christianity is to be like, right? We are people who have submitted ourselves to the will of another. So when we are told to go, we must go, trusting that God knows what he's doing. Now, I've said many times when we place our faith in Christ, we turn the pink slip of our life over to him. And you know what? Every once in a while, God checks to see if I meant that. Every once in a while, he says, "Will you follow me even now when there is a great cost?" And the answer has to be, "Your will be done, not mine." But saying that isn't always easy, is it? And I'm sure it wasn't for Daniel. We put Daniel on a pedestal, but the reality is he was just a man like us. So imagine the internal warfare that was happening in him, that internal dialogue we're all so familiar with, that struggle we have with our flesh as it offers up excuse after excuse not to obey when there's a cost to it. Our flesh is an expert at justifying disobedience, isn't it? Now put yourself in Daniel's place, and that internal dialogue probably went something like this. He might have thought, "I'm just a kid. Nobody would expect me to refuse the most powerful man on earth," or, "Everybody else is doing it. Why should I be the only one ripped out of my homeland, living in exile that isn't enjoying these benefits? I mean, it's bad enough being away from home. At least this will make it a bit more tolerable." Or, "Because I'm away from home, no one will ever know. So I'm going for it. Bring on the wine." There's a saying, the test of true character is what you do when you know nobody will find out. Or here's a good one. "I probably shouldn't do this, but, if I do, there's a good chance I can raise up in the ranks and be a leader. Then, Lord, you could really use me for your kingdom, so I'm really doing this for you. Hey, you're welcome." It's the old lottery ticket argument, isn't it? "Lord, if I win this, I promise I'm going to give 10%. No, make that 20% to the church." And we're saying that to a God who says, "I paved my streets in gold. I don't really need your money." But the point is, it's just so easy to justify not doing what we think God wants us to do. But compromise is always so dangerous. One compromise always opens the door to another that's just a bit bigger. Then that opens the door to another that's even bigger still, then bigger, bigger, bigger. And all the time we're losing our love for God. It's being cooled. The affections of our heart are being stolen by the things of the world. Now, Sherry L. Dew said this, speaking of the passage where Esau trades his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. She said, "Men and women who sell their birthright for a mess of pottage will tell you that their demise began with something small, with some seemingly insignificant breach of integrity that escalated. The little things do matter. It is not possible to profess righteousness while flirting with sin." And that's true, but it's so easy to convince ourselves as we're moving into greater sin that it's really not that bad. We're going to be okay. I like what Corrie ten Boom said in The Hiding Place. She said, "This was the great ploy of Satan in that kingdom of his. To display such blatant evil, one could almost believe one's own secret sin didn't matter. And so the devil points out the incredible evil in the world all around us, then hisses, "See? In comparison, you're doing great. Stop worrying. Just enjoy yourself." And it all makes our secret sin seem trivial and light. Like it's no big deal. But it's not trivial and light. It never is. That sin was enough to send Jesus to the cross. So how do we face tough decisions like this? So let's look at this. This is how to face tough decisions. Well, I think we need to narrow our focus down to what is important. And that is always what God has said. But rather than just responding to His truth, you know what? Instead, so many times we toy with it. We delay our decision to obey. And what happens when we do that? We open the door to our imaginations, getting involved and running wild. And when we allow our imaginations to get involved in these issues, we're in trouble because our imagination will grab a hold of the situation and start painting exaggerated outcomes that all somehow end up being bad. I call them the what ifs. If I do this, then what if this happens? What if that happens? And eventually we can end up convincing ourselves that obedience in this situation is going to ruin our life, so no thanks. Again, we are determining if we are going to obey or not based on a perceived cost. The result is we begin wrestling with God, don't we? And when we do that, we become miserable. Our joy leaves, our victory leaves, our peace leaves. We start to strive and we start to scheme rather than rest. It's just a miserable place to be. So what you must do is you must interrupt that process. You must simplify your decision-making like Daniel did. See what God said and respond to it. Be led by truth. Don't give room to your imagination. It's not going to take you where you need to go. But what about the consequences then? Well, here's what you've got to do. Just leave those consequences with God. He's sovereign. Again, simplify it. I'm going to obey you, Lord, and I'm going to leave all the consequences of that obedience to you. And think of this. This should help. You have a book of promises, and one says all things are going to work out for your good. All things. So trust God that He meant what He said. But now listen carefully because this is important. Accept the fact that what you think is good for you and what God knows is good for you may be two different things altogether. We want comfort and ease and big bank accounts, and that's what's good for me, right? But God may be saying, right now you need trouble and leanness so that I can develop your faith and perseverance. And He says, that's what's good right now. But real faith, now lock on here. This is so important. Real faith, not that phony faith that dictates to God what we think is best. So real faith says, I trust you and your will. I trust that you know what you're doing even when I can't understand it. So I give you my life, do with it what you please. You said this will work out for my good in the end, and I believe that. So that's how we handle these tough decisions. Simplify it. Just do what God says and leave all the consequences to Him. Now, there's another thing I saw here that really hit my heart. It's the impact of example. Daniel didn't become spiritually strong in Babylon. That happened in Jerusalem, where he experienced revival as a young boy when Josiah was king. Now, a quick history of Josiah and the revival. He became concerned about the appalling condition of the temple, and he hired men to refurbish it. As they were working, they discovered scrolls. They were dusty, they were unused, and they discovered it was the law of God given to Moses by God Himself. And so they took the scrolls to the king, who read them and was overcome by grief. He saw how disobedient the nation had become, and so he calls the nation to himself, and they listened as he read the whole law. Then in 2 Kings 23, he committed himself before the nation to follow the Lord and to keep the law with all his heart. And that was the beginning of revival in Judah, where Daniel lived. A revival led by Josiah on the throne and the prophet Jeremiah giving spiritual instruction. Now here's the thing. The people followed Josiah's example, and they gave themselves to the Lord also. And what struck me here was the power of example. The power of Josiah choosing no compromise, and that choice affected a nation, including Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then, in this book we're studying, we'll watch as that example is duplicated in the lives of these young men. The Lord is going to use their choice of no compromise powerfully to affect many others. Now, I bring this up to show you what your choices can do, how powerful they can be. Now, They may not start a spiritual revival in a nation, but they can start one in your home, impacting your children. It can make a difference at work or at school as God uses it to impact co-workers or fellow students. Joe Folk said this, and this is really important about the power of choice, both good and bad. He says, there is no more confused message that you and I could give to a lost and dying world than to live in sin and at the same time to tell people about the transforming power of Jesus Christ. There isn't a more confusing thing we can do to our kids and the generation behind us. God will not use a compromised life to reach a compromised world. God will use a life that is given over to Him, that is a demonstration of the message that through the power of Jesus Christ and His love, He can transform our lives and set us free. So, God wants to use your life and my life as a visual aid to affect others around us, who will then affect others around them. That's the way it has always worked in the kingdom, right? God calls a person who refuses to compromise, then his or her example affects others who choose the same path where their example will affect others. And we see this with Paul. He's chained in a Roman prison, but he chooses not to complain, but to serve God wholeheartedly, resulting in being filled with joy. And you see this joy in his writing. Example, Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. And think of this. Here is Paul, the great missionary. He's so used to freely moving from country to country, planning churches and seeing miracles. But man, what can he do now in chains? Well, here's what he can do. He can shine. He can serve. He can trust that God has him there for a reason. He understood God is sovereign, so these things don't happen by accident. So as Paul serves faithfully, wholeheartedly, filled with joy, others are watching his example, and some are getting saved, while others are being encouraged to serve the Lord more boldly. So the example of Paul, his choice of no compromise, his choice to trust God so much that chains don't touch his joy, that example radiates out of that prison cell to affect many around him, who in turn then will affect many around them. And as Paul sees the result, I'm sure he was amazed how God was using him in those chains, how that didn't stop anything, and that only increased his joy. So brothers and sisters, what is our example like? Can I encourage you to shine for your King? And as you do, it will affect others, which is going to add greatly to your joy, just like it did Paul's. Now let's get back on track here. Daniel was spiritually strong long before he was taken to Babylon. He was a product of example and of revival. He had learned God's word years before and had fallen in love with the one who had given it. So God had been preparing him in Jerusalem for his testing in Babylon. And that's the way it works, right? God never gives us trials He hasn't already prepared us for. And that means the trials you are going through today are necessary to prepare you for what you're going to go through in the future. So what have we seen so far? Daniel makes the decision he will not compromise. Now let's look at how important that decision was. This is, again, this section, the importance of the decision. We've seen Babylon's goal was to turn Daniel into just another Babylonian, one whose allegiance was not to God, but to King Nebuchadnezzar. But here's the thing, if Daniel had compromised here, if he had gone along with that program, that would be the end of this book. Because everything that follows flows out of this determination that God would be number one in his life, and that he would live a life of obedience for God's glory, regardless of the personal cost. This determination is so important in the book of Daniel, but it's so important for all of us, isn't it? A setting of our heart towards God's will. John Calvin said a very interesting thing. He said, "It is not lawful for you to make a compromise with God, to try to fulfill part of your duties and to omit others at your own pleasure." This is what Spurgeon called intermittent religion. God is Lord when you want him to be, when it's convenient and he's not asking anything uncomfortable from you, but you are Lord when you want to be. So you split the lordship duties. You're both part-time Lord. But it's all on your terms, isn't it? You'll choose when he's on and you'll choose when you're on. He says, I want you to do this, but you don't want to, so you're Lord for that decision. But here's the thing. God will not subject himself to our convenience. Daniel understood this and determined he would follow God regardless of the cost, and this decision set the tone for the rest of Daniel's stay in Babylon. He would obey God when it was easy, but also when it meant the lion's den. And in 2 Chronicles, We see how God blesses somebody like this. 2 Chronicles 16:9, for the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. And Daniel was strengthened, wasn't he? I mean, he passed test after test in Babylon, and he was used greatly. And we see this when the jealous Babylonians wanted to destroy him. They searched for reasons to accuse him, and they couldn't find anything. No hidden transgressions in the closet. So their only hope was to make a law against praying, which means they understood his commitment to God. They understood that God directed everything in his life. So if they said you can't pray, he was going to pray anyway, even if it meant he would end up in the lion's den. And the Lord's strength sustained him for the 70 years he was in exile. So this decision is so important for all of us. But you know what? So is the timing of a decision like this. And let's look at that, the timing of the decision. We learn from Daniel that our choice to obey should be early on. He was taken captive, and the brainwashing would begin immediately. So right away, at the very beginning, Daniel is planting his flag. He's saying, this is who I am. I am going to follow my Lord above all things. Now, for us, it would be maybe early on in the school we attend, early on in a new job or a new neighborhood. You see, those decisions are important, aren't they? Those early decisions will set the tone and make obedience later much easier. But let me add this. Don't be obnoxious when you make your stands. Be gracious, loving, and gentle. Some believers need a lesson in tact, don't they? How to speak the truth in love, how to discuss a difference of opinion kindly. Now, I wish all Christians everywhere, and especially on YouTube, would take this passage to heart. 2 Timothy 2:24 and 25 says, and the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. Opponents must be gently instructed in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth. So we do speak the truth, but the way we speak it is important, isn't it? And we're going to see next week that Daniel was very gentle and very reasonable in the way he objected to the king's food and wine. He wasn't offensive and harsh at all. So set the tone early, but be loving in the way you do it. And that will really help with obedience down the road. But if you put it off, I'll let them know I'm a Christian later. I'll just act like them now, just for a little while. The danger is you might not let them know later. I've discovered when we try to hide who we are, we kind of start to slide. We get weaker and weaker. Why? Because we settle into a pattern where we're not saying anything, where we're not telling them who we are and that we're Christians, we're believers. And we get to a point where saying anything would be so uncomfortable, we don't. So we forfeit our chance of influencing them, and they end up influencing us. But Daniel started his stay in Babylon in that first choice by determining to put God first. So let's finish this up then. One more thought on the danger of compromise. And this is something the devil is always tempting us with, right? R.C. Sproul said, the fundamental deception of Satan is the lie that obedience can never bring happiness. So the devil is always hissing in our ear. And you know what he tells us? This is what's going to bring happiness. It's compromising in these situations. That's going to lead to blessing and promotion and popularity. So girls, give your body to that boy outside of marriage. That will lead to love and acceptance. No, it won't. Or lie at work. That will lead to promotion and a bigger paycheck and a happier life. And those type of lies are so powerful. But we must see what God says in his book. Scripture paints a very different picture of compromise. And everywhere we see it in God's word, it is always linked to some kind of loss, some kind of degradation of life. Adam compromised God's law and he lost paradise. And he lost fellowship with God. Abraham compromised the truth and lied about Sarah being his sister and not his wife. This allowed another man to take his wife Sarah into his bedroom. Fortunately, God stepped in and protected her. Sarah compromised God's word, not believing his promise that she would have a son. She told Abraham to sleep with her servant Hagar, who bore Ishmael. That began the conflict in the Middle East we are still dealing with today. Esau lost his birthright and its blessings by compromising for a meal. Aaron compromised his convictions about idolatry and lost the privilege of seeing the promised land. Samson compromised his morality with Delilah and ended up blind, just a joke, who was taunted by the Philistines. David compromised God's law and committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered Uriah to cover up his transgressions, and he lost his child. Solomon compromised by marrying foreign wives. The cost? The nation of Israel was divided. And let me add just one more. Judas compromised his relationship with Christ for 30 pieces of silver and lost his eternal soul. Now, there are others, but that's enough. The Bible teaches plainly, clearly, that compromise always degrades the life spiritually. It never leads to more joy, never leads to more happiness. But Daniel shows us in this book, true success comes from wholehearted obedience. We choose to obey no matter how tough that choice is, and we trust God with the consequences of that obedience. That is the path to blessing, and you see it again and again in Scripture. Well, brothers and sisters, thanks again for hanging out with me for this video. Hit those buttons, subscribe, like, and notify. YouTube sees that when you do, and they like it, and they push our videos out to more people. And if you want to support the channel, the links are in the description. All right, guys, I love you, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless you.